The SNES era of gaming is often looked back upon favourably. It was when games started to look a lot less abstract and much more convincingly artistic. For RPG enthusiasts, Square were at the top of their game towards the end of the console generation, releasing not just one, but two legendary RPG games back to back, Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger. Both of these games are excellent examples of the genre, and truly cemented Square as an all-time gaming great. Final Fantasy VI is the result of everything Square had learned about making RPG games up to this point, as well as making use of every trick available to them to create the most visually impressive game possible on the console. The results honestly speak for themselves. Yes, the graphics do look somewhat archaic from a modern perspective, but the way that the technology such as Mode 7 within the world map and in cutscenes are used are leaps and bounds above what was seen in the previous two Final Fantasy games. And what's more impressive is how the technology is used to complement both the story and the gameplay, be it through brilliant presentation or through impressive set pieces. Before I get too far ahead of myself here though, let's start where I always do and quickly go over the version of the game I played and compare it to what's available. Once again, there's a GBA port of the game which has very similar issues to Final Fantasy V's GBA port. Low FOV, bad audio quality, washed out visuals. It also came with an updated translation which changed some item names back to what they are in other Final Fantasy titles, so tonics are back to being potions, and Phoenix Downs are spelt correctly. But some other dialogue changes lack some of the charm that Ted Woosley brought to the table originally. The PS1 port of the game is mostly fine, but is utterly dragged down by the horrendous loading times. The last port is the Steam and mobile version, which, once again, is far from an ideal way to play the game, unfortunately. I'd argue this port is a lot better than Final Fantasy V one at least, but the art styles of the backgrounds and the characters still clash oddly, and the world map looks hideous in comparison. But it's far from awful. It still plays perfectly fine, helped by sticking with the grid style of movement from the SNES release, which the Final Fantasy V remake dropped and added to the bad game feel. In fact, due to the fast loading, more akin to the original game, I'd actually more readily recommend the Steam version over the PS1 version. But honestly, the best way to play the game is either with the original SNES version, titled extremely helpfully Final Fantasy III, or use a mod with this version called the Ted Woosley Uncensored Edition, which keeps the main script pretty much intact but adding back in some things that had to be censored at the time, as well as giving items and characters back their iconic names. Gameplay in Final Fantasy VI is familiar, we're still dealing with the ATB battle system, and same style of exploration in the overworld, towns, and dungeons with random encounters. It's a timeless gameplay loop, and it honestly struck gold with this in Final Fantasy IV. However, outside of these bare bones basics, a lot is different here. First of all, characters are truly unique. Each character has a unique action to use in the battle, which is fitting for their character. The biggest example for me is Sabin, who is a monk. As a monk, he has access to various special techniques known as blitzes, and to perform these moves, you need to input Street Fighter-esque commands into the menu. You can't input them exactly like Street Fighter, as rotating the D-pad will result in failures, but learning these commands and pulling them off in battle is a lot more fun and a lot more rewarding than simply choosing the battle option. Locke is a thief, a treasure hunter, which means that in combat he can use the steal command, and if you equip him with a certain trinket, you can turn that move into mug instead, which damages as well as stealing. Edgar is a machinist, and as such makes use of tools to dish out damage or deliberating effects. Cyan is a samurai, and his ability is his Bushin commands, which require you to wait while a meter fills up in real time to unleash more damaging moves the longer you wait. Every character has gimmicks like this, and while some are better than others, honestly such as random slot mechanics can just get in the bin as far as I'm concerned. They help you connect with the characters more as they become much more expressive with these systems in place. Customization is available for each of the characters again this time around, although it's a lot more tapered back compared to Final Fantasy V. There's no job system here. Instead we have Magicite, the crystals of this world, which can be equipped on characters so they have access to a summon once per battle. Depending on the Magicite, and as they win battles they will learn abilities tied to them. For example, equipping the Shiva Magicite to a character will allow them to summon Shiva once per battle, as well as learn a variety of ice spells over time to use forever. Some of them even add extra stat buffs on level ups, such as equipping Siren will increase that character's HP by an additional 10% on level up. It's a neat enough system, but it does end up making characters a little homogeneous in their magic repertoire, due to wanting each character to have an access of wider variety of spells, leaving their unique combat mechanics their only differentiating factor. This is barely an issue though, as going through the process is still mostly fun, and poking at its flaws feels more like nitpicking. Much like Final Fantasy V, the dungeons here are pretty fun little romps. None of them really last too long and often come with fun little gimmicks. One is set in a Magitech research facility, so navigating the dungeon means crawling through pipes and riding conveyor belts, but the most interesting dungeons come later in the game. One of these is set in a volcano, and to enter it you need to split the party into 2 groups of 4 and switch between them to solve pressure pad puzzles. They're not exactly brain twisters, but they help break up the flow of the game in a great way. Honestly, the atmosphere of the dungeons is the true star of them. The themes and visuals of them add a lot to the enjoyment, with some truly unique and memorable ones in the form of the Phantom Train, a ghostly train that transports the spirits of the dead to the afterlife, and the town of Zozo, which requires you to climb apartment buildings, jumping between them as you go. A couple of the scenarios involve auto-scrolling on-rails sections, like riding a raft down a river, or riding a minecart through a series of tunnels. The minecart sequence, while not exactly visually spectacular when looking back with a modern lens, is visually extremely impressive considering the hardware it's running on, and that it's an RPG game. These sequences usually help add to the feeling of being chased or desperation to the story due to the frenetic nature of the encounters, and that you have little control over the pace the fights are thrown at you. The final dungeon takes the concept of light puzzles and managing several teams to the extreme, breaking your group up into 3 teams of 4, and tackling the extremely long dungeon, taking on many different bosses, both mandatory and optional. Bosses in this game are mostly nothing new. Just like the past couple of games, the first boss is designed to show how the ATB system works, with a gimmick where you need to hold off attacks and wait, or suffer a massive damage hit. Mandatory bosses aren't too hard for the most part, and major ones have unique gimmicks. One example is the fight against Shiva and Differet, where a way to get through the fight with as little trouble as possible is making frequent use of Celeste's runic blade ability, which will draw in and absorb the Esper's spells, massively reducing the amount of damage your party takes. A lot of the bosses in the game make use of multiple parts, so part of the strategy with defeating them is figuring out which part of the boss should take priority to cripple their ability sets. This is a skill which will help you up to the final boss, which is a true test of your endurance. The last boss is extremely tough, and is a true test of your might. 4 tiers and mostly multi-part boss fights fought one after the other with no break. Again, exploiting weaknesses, especially to instant kill statuses, and big damage outputs are all but required to get through to the final phase with little issue. It's a fight that lasts at least 10 minutes, getting closer to 15 or 20 when you're as kind of underleveled as I was. The use of cutting edge technology at the time really helped make this the best presentation in a Final Fantasy game so far. The characters all have unique looks and have a healthy variety of poses and expressions to assist with the storytelling. My favourite addition to the way they've told the story here is making use of cutscenes within battles. The character sprites are of a quality where they're used in battle as well as out in the field, and so during certain story moments, or early on when Terra uses magic in battle for the first time, to Edgar's amazement, they stop and have an animated discussion about it. It's charming and it occurs naturally within the gameplay. It's presentation like this, and a blatant use of pushing and experimenting with the game tech, that demonstrates Square's dedication to telling the best story they can, and it helps that they pretty much nail it in that department too. The story is easily the most enjoyable of all the games so far. Final Fantasy IV told a relatively simple story about love, betrayal and redemption, but the setting and characters were relatively simple and generic, space whales aside. Final Fantasy VI throws all of that out the window. Generic fantasy setting? Forget it. Instead we have a steampunk-like setting where magic has been lost to the world and replaced with machines. Generic good boy hero? Forget that. Takes so many well-rounded characters it's actually a bit hard to pin down a single one as the main protagonist. There's a case for Terra being the main protagonist due to starting as her and being arguably the most central to the plot, but she's far from the only character who gets significant screen time. The story even goes so far in places as to allow you to choose which order you want to play scenarios in when the group is split up into smaller teams within the story. The game starts with an explanation of the world, how there was a war 1,000 years ago, which resulted in the power of magic fading from existence, but that there are those who wish for this power to return, heavily implying that the Empire is at the heart of this plot. 2 of the Empire's soldiers named Biggs and Wedge overlook the town of Nash with a mind-controlled Terra in tow, a fact that they seem pretty uncomfortable with due to her power, calling her a witch. The trio raid the town and make their way to their goal, a frozen Esper found within the mines. After defeating the creature being used to guard it, they approach the Esper, only for it to awaken and resonate with Terra, causing the Imperial troops to be eliminated and throwing Terra into unconsciousness. When she awakens, no longer under any mind control, she slowly regains memories, starting with her name and little else. She's told to flee, only to eventually need help. Luckily, Locke is around. He helps her escape, and the story plays out from there. Terra is wrestling with figuring out her nature as she doesn't feel she's all that human due to her seemingly unnatural abilities, and Locke's group, the Returners, seem to have a plan that involves Terra in specific. They meet up with Edgar at Figaro, a technologically advanced nation, and this is the point our main antagonist comes into play. Kefka is an awesome foe, who has some of the almost over-the-top evilness of Exdeath, but it's all played a lot more straight and in a much more engaging way. His madness stems from a greedy want for power, and he stops at nothing to gain it. And this is where I'm putting a spoiler warning. If the setup and what I've had to say about the gameplay so far has interested you, I highly recommend you get out there and play this game. I promise you won't regret it. I'm going to talk about some of the plot details, but after I'll talk about the music, so go to the timestamp on the screen now to jump to the music showcase, followed by my conclusion. Spoilers in 3, 2, 1. The Returners are looking to stop the Empire's use of Magitech to advance their conquering of the world. The Magitech is a strange new powerful technology that you get a small taste of in the prologue with the mech. As the story develops, we learn how a lot of the main cast are affected by the Empire, or Kefka in specific. Edgar is the king of Figaro, who were neutral in the war until Kefka came and tried to burn it down in order for him to give up Terra. Locke lost his lover to an attack from the Empire, who, while he had become estranged to due to an unfortunate incident that led her to lose her memories, never let go of his love for her. Sabin exiled himself to train as a monk due to the anger he felt towards the Empire for poisoning his father when he was young. Cyan's pain is the most present within the story though. Cyan is a master senior samurai for the Kingdom of Doma, and successfully helped repel an attack on Doma from the Empire, which Sabin witnesses on his journey. The man leading the attack, a general named Leo, a man who shows his enemy respect within the war, and may be the last general within the Empire with any shred of dignity, is called away by the Emperor, leaving Kefka in charge. He tries to remind Kefka that the enemy is still human before leaving. It falls on deaf ears, as Kefka is all too quick to resort to war crimes to win the battle, successfully poisoning the water supply to Doma. This kills pretty much everyone within the walls, save Cyan, including his wife and son, a fact that he struggles to get past until towards the end of the game. The last character that's pretty important to the plot is Celeste. While scouting South Figaro, Locke finds her being tortured under one of the houses. It turns out this feared Magitech Knight General of the Empire has turned traitor and spoke out against her deeds. Locke frees her, and she joins the Returners' efforts in opposing the Empire, a general of their army being a great source of information. She also has similar powers to Terra due to being able to use magic, which is something Terra uses as a conversation point, and is fascinated to meet someone similar to her. Celeste's defining moment is probably the opera house scene, which is honestly incredible. It's a great showcase for Nobuo Uematsu to show off how far he's come with composing music for the SNES. Her singing skill and ability to replace a professional opera singer is not established whatsoever before this though, so it does feel a little contrived. It's part of a plot to attract someone to snatch her, as the group learned of a guy who was going to kidnap his love, Maria, from the stage of the opera, and the group need him for his airship. The build-up for this expands on Celeste's and Locke's relationship and budding romance, and it's one that doesn't take up much of the plot or feel overly forced. The kidnapper is the character Setsuna, and honestly I think he's a bad character overall, unfortunately. He's not really a major part of the plot though, luckily, even if he does have his good parts. The centerpiece of all this is Terra though. Her background is the most central to the plot. As she recovers her memory, she recalls that she is a part Esper, and after the defense of Nash and the frozen Esper speaks to her once again, she explodes into her Esper form in an uncontrollable burst of emotions she can't contain. It's a great scene and reveal, and leads to her questioning her humanity, asking herself if she can still love, a feeling she doesn't even know she can feel. This information explains why she's so important to the Empire though. She was found as a baby after her mother and father, a human woman and an Esper man, attempted to stop the Empire from invading the Esper's homeworld. The Espers are the source of magic within the world, and through the magicite they leave behind when they die, their powers can be harnessed by humans. This is the heart of the Empire's power, the secret behind their magitech. They seek the ultimate power of the Espers, and as such the power of the Warring Triad, the god which granted the race of Espers this power in the first place to fight their war. The Empire experimented on this race, and used their power for their own wicked ends. This is what leads to the big plot event in the middle of the game. The Empire unleashed the Espers from their world into the current one, and upon learning of the fate of their brethren, caused massive damage to the Empire. The Empire wished for peace, but it's a ruse, and on the floating continent that rose within the chaos, they find their goal, the statues of the Warring Triad. Kefka is quick to take the power for himself, even killing Emperor Gestal in a way that shows his total disregard for others' life, simply throwing his corpse off the side like garbage. And in this act, Kefka wins. With his power, he plummets the world into ruin and attains godhood. Kefka isn't seen for the rest of the game until you confront him on his tower at the end. Instead, we start off as Celeste in this new world of ruin, alone on an island a year later. Cid is the only other survivor. Everyone else who made it with them threw themselves off the cliff due to the helplessness of the situation, he says. It's grim to say the least. Cid is sick, and while it's possible to save him, it's more likely you'll have him die on your playthrough, and this distresses Celeste immensely. She's lost her father figure, and there appears to be no hope left in this new world, and so tearfully throws herself off the cliff in a perfectly executed scene. She washes up on the beach near the house where a seagull with a bandana wakes her up, giving her hope that her friends may still live. She takes a raft that Cid was working on and finds herself back on the mainland to search for her friends. In the first town she comes across, we see directly how Kefka is affecting this world. The town has it in some arbitrary way angered God Kefka, and he's sending down his light of judgment to lay ruin to the town. She meets Sabin here and save a girl from a burning building, and together they agree to look for the others. What follows is a getting the band back together non-linear plot for the whole second half of the game. This often involves helping the characters reach the end of their character arcs, or helping them discover their meaning in life so they can fight for it. Terra has found refuge in a destroyed village, looking after the orphaned children and a couple with a newborn on the way. And only through time and her learning that her attachment to these people is the love she sought is what drives her to continue. Sion confronts his demons in Doma Castle, in a dream due to some form of demon, but in doing so finally learns to move on and push forward. Edgar and Sabin reunite properly and realise how good they are for each other, and their bond becomes closer than ever. Locke finds a way to resurrect his long lost love, if only for a fleeting moment, but he finally gets to say his goodbyes properly. There's tons of great little character moments like this, and while no one character is exceptional, the relatively even quality of the ensemble adds up significantly. The story overall is pretty strong. The first half sets up everything to forward the halfway point extremely well, and makes revisiting some areas really meaningful. The tone is well balanced too, with enough comic relief moments to help bring some levity to the ordeals at hand. Ultros is pretty much the Gilgamesh of this game, with most of his encounters being rather humorous, and some character interactions leading to naturally funny scenes, such as Gao calling Sion Mr. Thal due to the way he speaks. There is some little niggles though, I suppose. Due to the large cast, there's of course some dud characters. As I mentioned, I don't really care much for Setsuna, nor am I a massive fan of Gao, despite both characters being kind of charming in their own ways. I pretty much predicted both of their subplots. The large cast is pretty well balanced within their screen time within the plot though, with some of them getting extensive, exclusive scenarios to experience their character. It can be argued that the story never really focuses on one character enough, being spread a little too wide. Some characters might as well not exist though, mostly the optional ones. Mog barely affects the story in any way, and Morrow is just a yeti. Gogo I never actually found, and Realm's ability is so bad she might as well not be a playable character. The characters for the most part are already partly developed when we meet them too. An example being that while Celeste's scene at the start of the World of Ruin is touching and impactful, we don't really get the full sense of her character growth over the course of the game, because a lot of it has already happened before we meet her. We don't see why she defected from the Empire specifically, and we don't see much about the process of her becoming a Magitech Knight. You can apply a similar criticism to a lot of the cast here. I suppose the main problem with the story of Final Fantasy VI is that it's very much characters first, plot a close second. The story is pretty much character moment after character moment, with a very simple plot to drive them forwards. This isn't quite as damning as it sounds though, because the story is so much fun to engage with due to the charisma of the major cast. Kefka isn't a complex villain either. As I said earlier, he's a force of pure evil, but taken a bit more seriously than Exdeath. He's more successful a villain due to the fact he's touched many of the characters' lives in some way, but to understand him is a fool's errand. He's an evil clown at the end of the day, much like the Joker from the Batman series, in that he's an agent of chaos, not something to be understood and empathise with really. Welcome back to those who skipped ahead to avoid spoilers. There may be some mild visual spoilers in the music showcase here, but nothing plot related will be shown, I'll make sure of that. Anyway, the music of Final Fantasy VI is stellar. In here, even more so than in the previous few games, you can hear the style that composer Nobuo Uematsu will bring forward to the PlayStation games. And of course, it's an excellent soundtrack. Highlights include Awakening, Phantom Forest, Sion's theme, Shadow's theme, Celeste's theme. The decisive battle. Terra's theme. Strago's theme. Battle to the death. And of course Dancing Mad, although I have nowhere near enough time to play a satisfying amount of it. This track in particular truly fits the epic scale of the final battle. So the final question, how does this rank against the series so far? While not flawless, this is the most engaged I've been with a story in the series so far, and the additions to the traditional battle system with character specific battle mechanics really freshen up the gameplay compared to the previous games. I miss the job system dearly, and the Magicite system is an okay replacement, although it does feel only partially baked as a gameplay mechanic. Overall, I'd probably still fall on FF6's side with the gameplay though, mostly due to the interesting set pieces, great dungeons, and the open-ended nature of the second half of the game, jam-packed with secrets and optional content. So all told, I'd say that this tops Final Fantasy V, and that game already was better than what came before for me, so this game obviously sits above that. So the rankings so far are as follows. Number 1 Final Fantasy VI, number 2 Final Fantasy V, number 3 Final Fantasy IV, 4 Final Fantasy 1, 5 Final Fantasy 3, 6 Final Fantasy 2. Thanks for watching. I'll be taking on Final Fantasy 7 next. Oh boy. In the meantime, likes, comments, shares, all are appreciated. and I hope to see you next time.